have a conversation that I've been really looking forward to. The prison abolitionist movement is definitely gaining a little bit of steam. The debates and conversations surrounding it have been kind of front and center on social media. And I think it's really important to understand what the abolitionist movement is, what they want to do in terms of criminal justice reform. And joining us today is someone I deeply respect, a wonderful woman by the name of Olayemi Olurin, who is a public defender for the Legal Aid Society in New York, and also a political commentator. Ole, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all for having me. I'm excited.
Let me just start off by saying thank you so much. I know I thanked you on social media, but I want to thank you now that I get to talk to you, because this has been something that, to be fair, I think the way that I communicate and frame things was not friendly to people who identify as abolitionists. Yes. And so I think it's easy to immediately attack and dogpile, but you were the one person who didn't do that. And you actually provided some information, some answers to our questions that was so helpful. So I thought it would be better to have a more elaborate conversation about it on the show. And so let's start off by kind of understanding, what is the prison abolition movement? What would that ideally look like?
All right, so first of all, thank y'all for having me. I didn't dogpile, I did not attack, because I understand that it sounds wild. It sounds wild to anybody the first time you hear it. Even as somebody, when it was first presented to me that abolition was even a concept, I was in the middle of writing a thesis about how the criminal system is racist and unjust, and even I was like, abolish all the prisons? That seems absurd. And my professor presented me with reading materials, and it was a process. I can't tell you what day I woke up and decided it, but I recognized that, listen, we all are raised in a society that tells us prisons are fundamental. One of the first things we learn, cops, robbers, police are good. We need to know 911. We think of that way. So we see the criminal justice system like water, oxygen, air, and these kinds of things. And so I expect people to have pushback. I expect it to sound absurd because my mother tells me it's absurd every other day. So I do get it. So I wasn't upset. But what it really is it's a vision of tomorrow. People hear it, abolish prisons now, and they think we mean open up all the prisons, close all the courts, and it's done tomorrow. We recognize realistically it does not work like that. But what we're saying is, listen, we currently have a massive prison industrial complex. This is a country that once went from 200,000 people, maybe nationwide, being in prison, to now 2 million people. More prisons begets more prisons. They make more. The more we incarcerate, the more they continue to incarcerate and police these same kinds of communities. But yet, every day we say crime is getting worse. We don't feel any safer. We have the same exact hysteria despite constantly giving more money to police, constantly putting more money into the criminal system. So what we're saying is, instead of the resources that we've placed in building this large prison industrial complex, let's instead address the root causes of crimes. Because I know people tend to think an abolitionist is an anarchist, the purge, we want danger. That's not what it is. What we're saying is the same communities that are being criminalized, the same communities that you're calling the criminal defendants, those are the victims too, right? It's the same communities being over policed, are the same communities being over incarcerated. So they're also under resourced. As a public defender, I could say the vast majority of the people in the criminal system live well beneath the poverty line. And when I say well beneath the poverty line, I myself identify as the poor, and I would not be able to afford my own services. I mean, completely destitute. And so if the majority of the people in the system are this, they're under-resourced in that way. And the issues that we're having are coming out of those communities and not having the resources for mental health. There are more people in America, there are more people suffering from mental health issues in prisons than there are in mental health hospitals. But we have that. We're saying, okay, let's start taking that money away from the police. We have overinflated budgets. We have large police forces, so much that one would argue that this is a police state. If by over time, we start taking this money away and instead putting it into the community infrastructure, we will eventually have a society that doesn't rely on mass incarceration. So it's a step-by-step process like that.
So Ole,
go ahead, Jake.
I think there's a couple of different issues here, right? So there's the politics and the policy, right? And there's, I'm sure, a bunch of things we obviously agree on. So for example, would I abolish some type of prisons? So obviously, I want to get rid of private prisons tomorrow. They make no sense. It's all the wrong incentives. We're basically paying people to take away people's freedom. So they're going to do that at a larger and larger rate to profit off of it. So there's plenty of circumstances where some form of abolition makes sense. And I think that at the end of the day, we'll probably agree on a great majority of things. But help me understand what the long-term vision is. So you explain how we're going to get there, but one of the issues I have with the abolition movement is people are reluctant to say what the final product is. So is there no prisons at all? Or is it a prison under a different name or a reduced prison? So let's get clarity on that.
I think, let me just say, I am not the full architect of what are the visions for every place, right? But I think we do want to get to a place where we say, all right, warehousing people isn't addressing the issues. I recognize, while I do believe that we have a country and a society that sensationalizes crime, what people think people are in the prison system for, what people are being charged and incarcerated for, is not what it is. I've represented over 1,000 people, and I've yet to meet this, big bad evil person as someone who I couldn't see. I couldn't see exactly how they ended up here and what different institutions have failed them. That being said, obviously, we need community involvement, what communities think they need. That's the first thing on how we address these different issues, and oftentimes we do have that. When it comes to, I know we're thinking of the serial killers, these kinds of, who they cut very few of anything you ever see. I've never seen them. I think I can't say whether or not it's going to be they abolish all the prisons or what that's going to look like the day that comes to on policy implementation, what system we're going to come from. But I do think we do have to start looking to different countries that don't have the prison industrial complex we have, whose prisons don't look like what we have, who don't have these kinds of side effects, and seeing how they address these issues and what we could have, what kind of infrastructure we could have in place. But I do think, as far as it currently is, the mental health problems are exacerbated. We still have those people. We're still, as a country, we're paying for all of the big, bad, evil people that we're putting in, we quote unquote put on prisons. We're paying for all of that. We're not exactly solving the problems and all of the issues that are still recycling. So I can't say specifically what the structure would look like. I think that's going to require the communities themselves to decide, how do we best address the problems? What do we think we have there, and what we would have happen to these people? So I can't definitively answer you, Cenk, there, but I do understand that concern. And I think a lot of that does come to maybe some misconceptions we have about crime and who's in the system and who's the majority of the people there and for what.
Yeah, look, I totally agree that, I think poverty is a pretty good indicator of whether someone has committed a crime. You can tie it to those root causes. So I totally understand that. In fact, one of the things that LA actually did right, but it was kind of destroyed by COVID, was Los Angeles had a pretty big problem with gang violence. Right. And we're seeing it become more of a problem again because the programs, like the diversion programs that were implemented that were so successful, were no longer available during COVID because people were, they had to isolate themselves in order to prevent the spread of COVID. And so I think that there are certainly programs that can address those root causes in a meaningful way. But I feel like sometimes when it comes to this debate, we're kind of talking past each other because of the terminology, right? So what I like to think about is, when I think about the ideal, I wouldn't say ideal, I'm sure it has its own flaws, but when I look at models in other countries that seem to have worked, I look to Norway, which I will say, when I first heard about Norway and the way they do things with their criminal justice system, I found it, this is like years and years ago, I thought it was super questionable, like Anders Breivik getting sentenced to 21 years, and he has like a nice situation with like a PlayStation that isn't updated enough for him. He wants the latest model. But you look at their recidivism rates, and their recidivism rates are so low compared to the United States because we don't rehabilitate. So would you say that a model like one that's being implemented in Norway is a good goal to work toward, or does the abolitionist movement want to go further than that?
So I think a fundamental component to why people argue abolition, it's not an unwillingness to embrace reform. It's not this inherent issue with reform. It's recognizing that the criminal system in the US is not a mistake. The actors and the powers that be want it to operate the way it does. People are always willing to advocate for reform. As an abolitionist, I'm constantly, I have to spend my days fighting for bail reform and fighting to defend it even once we get it. Oftentimes what happens is even the most modest of reforms that are suggested even make it. You see the exact actors that be, you see the lawmakers, you see the police unions, you see them fight you tooth and nail because they don't want the system to change from what it is. So it's not that an abolitionist has a problem with reform or they don't think models like that work in places. The difference is those countries have a very different focus. Maybe in some places where you see they have a rehabilitative criminal system, it's not an accident. It's not an accident that we have the criminal system we have and they have that. It's because their intentions are different. What they use the system to do are different. Here in America, we have the prison industrial complex is just To be frank, it is nothing more but, a legally sanctioned slavery. That's what it is. We have massively incarcerated and policed particular communities. We use them for prison labor, regardless, private or public prisons. People are used for prison labor. We take the poorest of the communities and we put them there and we charge them with major fines on top of the time that they've spent, the psychological impacts of that on them and their families, their long-lasting effects of criminalization and having a criminal record. And that does that because it keeps particular communities and people subjugated. So it's not that I don't believe in a different world where we had a Nordic model, we could help the people incarcerated. What I'm saying is the criminal system we have is not designed to help those people at all. In fact, even talking about it from the perspective of the people, all of the people in the system being the problem, they all need rehabilitation, when in fact, that's not often what it is. It's that they're in the position in the first place that they live in communities that aren't helped and they're profiled and they're targeted in a particular kind of way. I just came home on the way here and there were over 10 cops on the corner of Flatbush Junction just harassing Black kids playing and arresting them because they said they felt soda splash on them, and they arrested them. And that's what's happening in Black communities like where you live. So it's not that I disagree with you, Anna, that a Nordic model could be effective. It's that America doesn't have any interest in implementing such a thing because they want the system to operate as it is. So that's why people want the system abolished, because they're saying what it fundamentally is designed to reproduce this kind of injustice.
Okay, so in the meantime then, so let's say there's enough of a fight where people are on board for the abolitionist movement, right? In the meantime, as those root causes are being addressed, what does happen to perpetrators of violent crime? And I want to be specific about the types of individuals I'm talking about, right? Like, I do believe that we over-incarcerate. I do not think that most nonviolent offenders should be in prison. And when I say most nonviolent offenders, keep in mind, I'm considering like Wall Street goons who completely devastated our economy and led to countless foreclosures. I think people like that do deserve to deal with some punishment, right? They typically don't. But just to get back to the question, so I'm a little concerned about what happens if living in California, living in Los Angeles, where we have a massive homeless population, many of whom have severe mental health issues that go untreated, undiagnosed. That is a result of the deinstitutionalization that started actually under JFK, right?
Yeah.
And there was widespread support for doing away with these mental health facilities because of all of the issues they had. They were abusive. There were terrible, terrible examples of abuse. And so everyone was on board to do away with them. And the whole idea was, okay, we'll replace them with community-based mental health. But that didn't end up happening. So we ended up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. So I think about how this would play out if we applied it to prisons. And I think about people who do mass shootings on elementary school campuses, and those people need to be incapacitated. So what happens with people like that under a system? And how do you avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
I think I usually don't get into a conversation of deserves. That's not something much I think about, because I think oftentimes that's what leads to carceral responses. Listen, I'm a human being like everybody else. There are going to be people and things that I see, and my initial reaction is throw them under the jail. You want to feel that in your spirit. But what I want to focus on is what I think is better and what ultimately will prevent these kinds of issues from reoccurring. And oftentimes incarceration is just simply not the answer to that. I rarely do you see somebody go in prison or in jail and the situation becomes better. And in fact, even the few people that you see that do survive it, that come out and do other things, it's usually in spite of it and some other, miracle scenario. So when it comes to that, I don't like a conversation of deserves. I like a conversation of what I think will help. But as far as throwing out the baby in the bathwater, listen, like I said, this isn't something that happens tomorrow. And even with the most modest of reform efforts that you even see be proposed, because reform is, we're walking, right? If you look at it as a long journey, we're walking from reform to hopefully this ultimate dream. They're not going to start off with the what you call it, the school shooters and these people. Who are, by the way, anomalies. Those are not the people that represent are representative of who's mostly in the criminal system. It's just not. The most people you walk into a court, you're just gonna see poor Black and brown people there for like familial squabbles they're having, issues they're having in their relationships, these regular things, but it's not gonna be that. But it's not a matter of recognizing that these people aren't bad, or they haven't done something terrible, or they don't deserve punishment. It's a requirement. I think we are required to interrogate how we got there. I think oftentimes, even when if you even take the school shooter examples, right, or the amount of those we get recently, or the amount of shooters, mass shooters we have, period. And you see they have manifestos, they have agendas, they have this. These are not people that are just jumping out the window like Batman villains. These are people that are they are making decisions to do things based on fundamental ideologies, different things that they think and believe. And I think we have to interrogate those as a society and root that out, because the reality is, whether or not we have prisons, don't have prisons, if we allow for these same things that cause it to exist, that we're going to keep getting this. We're going to get these school shooters, we're going to get these mass shooters, no matter how we deal with them. So to me, those questions require us to say, okay, let's look at these bodies of alarmist criminals we like to think of in these examples, and let's try to figure out what they have in common. Because right now, the majority of the people in the criminal system, all they have in common is poverty and being of marginalized communities. But as far as these shooters, let's interrogate how they got there, what's helping them get there, usually access to guns, widespread gun manufacturing, all these kinds of things. So my answer is still, let's figure out how we prevent it from reoccurring.
So Olay, this is an interview, but it's also a discussion, right? So yes. I want to be clear about my thoughts on it and then ask you a question. Look, yes. I think that if you say, let's reform prisons in a massive way, I totally agree. Wrong people are being in prison, totally agree. Let's go to the root causes. Totally agree. By the way, I wish the prison abolition movement would have a much more sound plan A, B, C, D. This is exactly how we're going to get to the ideal end goal. And people constantly say, well, I don't have all the details. Partly I understand that, but partly it's incumbent upon you, if you're in that movement, to come up with a workable plan. And and especially as you said, Olay, in the beginning, if you're doing something that sounds as extreme as abolishing prisons, you better have an excellent plan. And so far, I haven't really heard that. But if you want me to join that pathway in that plan, I'm happy to do all of the first steps, right? Reform prisons in all the ways that we've discussed in this. But I don't believe in a utopian end goal where there are no prisons.
I mean, and that's fine. Listen, Cenk, that's fine. I want you to know that's fine. I don't need you to believe in that or come off this phone call, this chat thinking that you're an abolitionist. Now, honestly, what really becomes a hindrance, if we agree, listen, there's going to be a whole large side of the spectrum. And I want to believe we're ultimately fighting for the same things. If we recognize that we have this prison system and it doesn't necessarily amount to public safety, that we recognize that there's systemic racism and injustices coming from it. If we could, at the very least, work together to accomplish to get this, it's about how we speak about what the other people are doing. You know what I mean? If you ultimately recognize you can share in this larger vision, at least you might not be living in a utopian society, but you recognize that there's something wrong and fundamentally we want to rid ourselves of those wrongs. If you recognize that people working on that are doing that, it's about not speaking out against them. One, two, as far as the work you do in the interim, it's about understanding your place in a movement. For me in particular, I'm a public defender. How I go about this is, one, beyond representing people in criminal court every day and trying to get them out, I'm very involved in policy and reform movements and trying to change the system that we're currently in to work towards that. So today I came out with an op-ed on bail reform. I'm actively, pushing bail reform, drawing attention to the Rikers crisis and doing these things. So I wouldn't say that the organizers on the ground, they are involved. All these different movements that you see that you have to fight for on the day-to-day basis, those are very much so the steps and how we're working towards that. If you see all these community initiatives trying to get mental health, in one of the states, they just recently made it so you have a mental health first responder. You see different people advocating for taking police off of traffic infractions and these kinds of things. All those different movements and initiatives you see with people trying to divest from policing and instead build up community resources, and you see those, that is people working towards abolition. But listen, I respectfully understand where you're coming from, Cenk.
So, Olay, I appreciate that, but we also have a short-term problem, okay? So, I also don't agree in a utopian society where we do not put people in prison in the short term and hope that hey, hopefully the system will catch up to the ideal. No. If we're gonna do it at all, we have to do it step by step. And I want to get to the Norwegian model, not to abolition, right? But even if you want to get to the Norwegian model, you have to go step by step. You have to have the mental health treatment, et cetera, in place before.
And it actually,
we say, hold on, guys, let me finish. Before we say, hey, you know what? We're not going to put these folks in prison. Because Olay, right now, what we did, I was massively in favor of bail reform. I'm beginning to think I was wrong. And and why, and reducing some crimes. Look, it makes a lot of sense because the things that the sentences we fought for, and you're a public defender, so you'd have an interesting perspective on this. The sentences we fought for, I think, are the better sentences, the more just sentences, the ones that are reduced. But the problem is the prosecutors need room for plea deals. And since they don't have room for plea deals, they're bringing them all the way down to almost nothing. So then the prosecutors aren't bothering to prosecute these crimes, and the cops aren't bothering to arrest people. And Olay saying it's not happening it's not productive. It's
you're saying, Cenk, you want to say, you're telling me it's not productive, but I'm actually the person that represents people in court and has a literally living array of what the system looks like. And I can tell you that 1, the arrests are happening. 2, studies have already come out and showed that in terms of being rearrested for violating pretrial bail conditions, that has not changed. Whether or not crime rates, Cenk, that is simply the case. But here's the thing, I wanna circle back to my original point earlier with why even the modest reform efforts to get us towards people criticize abolition when people say the system is not broken, it's working as intended. We're going to keep recycling these exact same effects. And I say the problem is not that people would not get on board with reform. Abolitionists is that we recognize that even the reform, even the most modest of reforms, risk experience this kind of pushback and lack of support. So I want to say that 1. 2, when it comes to bail reform, if we want to look at a place like New York City, right? The majority, we have 10 million people in this city, 42% of which are white. Yet over 90% of the people at Rikers are Black or brown people. Rikers is a pretrial detention center. It was built to hold 3,000 people. It holds 5,000. We had bail reform come in to make misdemeanors, only misdemeanors, not completely nonviolent crimes, traffic infractions, these things not bail eligible. Because despite the fact and the sensationalism you see from New York Post and the particular occasional cases they highlight, that's not what the majority of people are sitting in Rikers for. I'm just so sorry to tell you. And so that we get overcrowded, we get people dying. We had the largest amount of deaths since 2013 last year, 16 last year, we're already at 15 this year. So this continues to happen, and that happens at pretrial detention centers all around the country. And in terms of plea deals and pressures for plea deals, most things in the criminal system don't end in the criminal conviction. Right? Most things in the criminal system never see the light of a trial. What happens is they arrest poor people, they're able to place cash bail on them, and because these people they're free, they can't buy their freedom, they accept plea deals, they take time served, they accept criminal convictions just because they want to get out. Even though if the system actually were allowed to play out the way it's supposed to and afford them their rights, that wouldn't have happened. And then they get out, and now they have a criminal conviction that makes it worse. These were already the poorest people in society, a fact that the court recognized when they assigned them a public defender and when they gave them bail. And yet these people now have a criminal conviction that prevents them from getting any kind of job. They usually lost the job that they have. It affects their housing. There's orders of protection, and their lives are changed in fundamental ways that no longer just impacts them, but impacts their family. And a cycle of that contributes to violence, it contributes to crime, and it doesn't help anybody get anywhere. So as far as what you're talking about with bail reform, the reality, despite the fear mongering and everything that's happened, is it hasn't changed our crime rates. People who are being released from Rikers, or they're not being detained because their cases are not. Cenk, you don't have to agree. You don't have to agree with me, yeah. But the reality is, I have experience with it. So
yeah.
Wait, hold on. I'm sorry, but Olay's responding to me shaking my head off camera, which she can see, and I'm happy to do it on camera, right? So look, the first of all, number of people rearrested awaiting trial is all the way up to 33% of the detainees in New York. And so the idea that it's not happening is just not true. And you have your perspective on it, which is really valuable, and that's why we're having this discussion. Olay is telling you, in her experience, that is the recidivists, et cetera, are a tiny minority. The overwhelming majority are poor folks.
Cenk, do you believe in a presumption of innocence?
Yeah, of course I do.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. Olay, hold on, let me finish. But Olay, you're invalidating the experiences of all tons of middle class and working class and poor people in this country who are saying there's a guy on the corner selling fentanyl. I'm calling the cops. They're not coming. There's a guy on the corner with a gun. He's pointing it at me as I'm walking into my apartment. I call the cops. They're not coming. And they're not coming because they say, and by the way, I think the cops are terrible. I think they should be forced to do their jobs, and if they don't, they should be fired immediately, okay? But they say, hey, listen, the prosecutors aren't prosecuting. And the prosecutors are saying we don't have enough room for plea negotiations. You're saying that's, I don't know what you're saying.
You're saying to me that we need to have a cash bail system so that prosecutors can better coerce people. No, hold on. Let me respond to this. It sounds like you live in Gotham City, Shank, but I live in New York City, where you can call the police and you will be very much so arrested. I don't know what you're talking about. We have massive amounts of cases. We have people being arrested 24/7. Bail reform does not affect people being able to make arrests. Like I said, felonies, violent crime, cash bail is still being set on these things. The only things cash bail is not being set on are a small amount of misdemeanors and low-level traffic infractions. We just not only do we have we have over 35,000 police in NYPD, but we recently hired more. We increased their $10.4 billion budget to $200 million more dollars. So I don't know why we're talking about the police like they are handicapped and like arrests aren't happening. Additionally, you're saying I'm invalidating the concerns of poor people and Black people. And so I don't know what you're talking about, but I am a Black person that lives in Brooklyn in Flatbush. And I don't know many Black people that are fully in favor of the massive police state we have or the criminal system that affects us. And importantly, as much as we talk about this, we have this alarmist discussion of crime, and the people that are experiencing the most crime, the people that live in these communities, these high crime areas, these highly profile, they're the same people that are the victims of crime, the same Black people that are victims of crime, brown people that are victims of crime, the same people you're criminalizing and vilifying and saying, okay, we shouldn't have these systems in place so that prosecutors can barely coerce them into plea deals or get them to do these things. I think you're relying on a lot of what is just ultimately propaganda. That is a thing. They put out these articles. All right, Jake, but
okay, listen, hold on. Let me jump in, please. Let me jump in because I'm dying to. I actually, look, I don't have a problem with bail reform. I actually think using bail as a way to determine whether someone gets to go home prior to the trial is ridiculous, right? And it's a way of kind of determining whether or not someone is a risk, right? And so the judge is trying to determine, well, this person seems risky, so what's a high amount for bail so I can prevent this person from being able to post bail and get out early. I think that whole system is messed up. So I have no problem with doing away with cash bail, but I do think it's important for the judge to have some discretion in regard to individuals who are accused of committing violent crimes, right?
And the judge does have that discretion.
No, you're right about that. Yeah. Okay, you're right about that. But I think that there is a misunderstanding, and I've been reading and researching about this because I've been trying to figure out why is it that in some parts of the country where they've done bail reform, specifically for misdemeanors, you have examples of judges giving alleged violent offenders no cash bail. Like, why is that happening? And it's because it seems like they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what the bail reform is supposed to entail. And I watched a great talk that you did in regard to Illinois and their safety measure, which they're applying this no cash bail method to nonviolent misdemeanor crimes. And you made sure to emphasize this is about misdemeanors. This is not about violent crime or violent offenders. And so it seems like you are honestly on the same page, right? I mean, I would like to see something else in place other than bail that determines whether or not an individual should be released. And one other thing that I don't think gets talked about enough is, why is it taking so long for the trial to happen? I mean, people are behind bars for years before they even get to see the first day of their trial. It's insane.
And I'll tell you why, because the system is deliberately punitive, right? What happens is the majority of people in our criminal system just would not, if we actually were able to prosecute every single case, everybody was able to go to a trial, everybody's able to have their hearings, evidence was be able to present it and everything. Most things simply just would be thrown out. They wouldn't be able to get criminal convictions. So what often happens is throughout the process, they make the process as laborious and punitive as possible. Let's keep adjourning it, even though there are cases we have at arraignments. We know it's said on the record, they will not be able to prosecute this. There's the alleged victim is in the audience saying absolutely not. And they say, you know what? Let's still gonna adjourn to this date. We'll work it out another time when we adjourn and we make this way. Because what happens is the time you have a criminal case open, your life is completely changed. And if you can't have your trial, if you're waiting in on jail, what happens is before you have a trial, you serve the time, even though eventually you might, they'll throw it out or they don't have the evidence or they'll decline to prosecute or you go to trial. But you've already suffered all the consequences, all the harm has actually been implemented. So that's why.
Olay, I wish we could spend the rest of the show talking about this. This is incredibly important. And I hope you'll come back on because we didn't even get through half the questions I wanted to ask you.
And thank y'all for having me, honestly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Olay, I love that you came on. I love the discussion, even when it gets heated. And I appreciate that you made as good a case for it as I've ever seen.
definitely.
Yeah, having said that, I don't agree.
I didn't think you would, Shank. I did not come here expecting. I did not think you would. I am just here to put the information out. I will be happy if at any point in time in the next months you say to me, if you say to me, I'm like, you know what? I thought about something you said. That's all I'm hoping to get. You know what I mean? That's all I can hope for.
And I would just caution everybody. First of all, don't tell people who've been at the toughest on cops in all of media that they're doing propaganda. I'm just gonna keep it real. I think that's out of bounds, to be honest.
Okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Me? So, I didn't say nothing to you.
Yeah, you said that I was doing propaganda. So, and look.
I didn't say you were doing propaganda. I said I think you're reading. I said I thought earlier. You mean during the segment? I said I thought earlier that I said that I think you're reading a propaganda. That's what's being put out. That wasn't at you, Cenk. That wasn't some personal attack towards you.
Yeah, and please, I hear you. And let's not get policy and politics mixed up. Policy is one thing, and these discussions are good, and it's going to get us to the right solution. And if we're all lucky, we're going to get to the Nordic model, and it's going to be infinitely better than what we have now. Okay, but at the same time, do not get this involved in politics today. It will destroy our chances of winning. The country is not ready for it. If anyone gets,
I don't have time to reply to this, right? Like,
I mean, you don't think anyone should run on this? That's just automatic loss, right?
I'm not sure that we have the time to have the discussion, and I like the discussion on this because I think this is really going to come to where our place is in a movement. My primary focus is not really right now Democrats versus Republicans. Is what can be done to keep Black people in the best position in marginalized communities. That they're not being railroaded by a criminal system, that they're not being profiled on the streets, that they're not being murdered on the streets. And I'm very interested in recognizing that a system that I get is being built and maintained on the backs of Black people and perpetuating that injustice. It is fundamentally, it has to go in the same way that and I get that might not be popular initially. I don't think any status quo like systemic racism in America survives by not being, fundamentally ingrained and being supported in some ways in these systems and people finding that outlandish. But my role there is not to do what I think is best or what the Democrats or the Republicans most want to hear or this voters discussion. My move, where I'm at in this movement, is what's best for getting us forward. And I recognize that it might sound crazy to you now, but in 20 years and 10 years and 5 years, it's not gonna sound that crazy to people coming up and being educated to push back against the status quo. But thank y'all for having me.
Thank you so much, Olay. I really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you, Olay.